Hey guys, tonight we dive into one of history's most misunderstood positions, being a medieval king. While Hollywood shows you glorious battles and noble courts, the reality is that wearing a crown in medieval times was essentially signing your own death warrant. These weren't rulers living in luxury, they were targets with crowns on their heads, constantly fighting for survival in a world where everyone wanted them dead. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive into tonight's nightmare together. Let's be clear, nobody in medieval times woke up thinking, you know what sounds fun? Being constantly paranoid about assassination while managing a kingdom full of people who want to kill me. Being a medieval king wasn't about sitting on a golden throne eating grapes, it was about surviving in a world where your own family members were plotting your murder, your nobles were scheming to overthrow you, and foreign enemies were constantly trying to invade your territory. The average medieval king lasted about as long as a mayfly in a hurricane, and those who survived did so through a combination of luck, brutality, and sleeping with one eye open. The first thing you need to understand about medieval kingship is that there was no such thing as a peaceful succession. Every time a king died, the kingdom exploded into civil war as every relative, noble, and ambitious warlord with a tenuous claim to the throne decided this was their moment to seize power. Being the rightful heir meant nothing when your uncle had an army and a willingness to stab you in the back. Kings didn't inherit thrones, they fought for them, usually against their own family members who were more than happy to turn family dinners into bloodbaths. The succession crisis was a medieval tradition that made Game of Thrones look like a children's tea party. Brothers killed brothers, sons murdered fathers, and mothers poisoned their own children if it meant securing power for their preferred candidate. The moment a king showed any sign of weakness, illness, or old age, the vultures started circling. Smart kings spent their entire reigns preparing for succession wars that would inevitably follow their deaths, knowing that their life's work would probably be destroyed by their own heirs fighting over the scraps. Think about what it means to live every single day knowing that your own brother might poison your wine tonight, or that your son is meeting with nobles who want to overthrow you. Medieval kings couldn't even trust their own food tasters because those tasters might be working for rivals who wanted the throne. They slept in different bedrooms every night, changed their routines constantly, and maintained multiple escape routes from every room in their castles. The paranoia wasn't mental illness, it was survival instinct. In a world where everyone was a potential assassin, even when you managed to secure the throne, your troubles were just beginning because medieval kings had to deal with the constant threat of rebellion from their own nobles. These weren't loyal subjects, they were essentially warlords with their own armies who had sworn allegiance only as long as it served their interests. The feudal system meant that every major lord in your kingdom was a potential rival who could raise an army against you the moment you made a decision they didn't like. Your nobles were supposed to provide military service in exchange for land, but in practice, this meant you were surrounded by armed men who could turn against you at any moment. The political balancing act required to keep your nobles in line was exhausting and deadly. Give one lord too much power, and he might decide he'd make a better king than you. Ignore another lord's grievances, and he might ally with your enemies. Try to centralize power, and they'd all unite against you as a tyrant. Medieval kings spent most of their time playing an elaborate game of chess where every piece on the board wanted to checkmate them, and one wrong move meant civil war or assassination. Consider the case of King John of England, who managed to unite virtually every noble in his kingdom against him through a combination of military failures, financial demands, and general incompetence. The result was the Magna Carta, which sounds noble in history books but was actually a humiliating document that stripped away royal power and essentially turned the king into a figurehead controlled by his nobles. John spent the rest of his short life trying to regain his authority, fighting civil wars against his own subjects until he died, possibly from poisoning. While his kingdom fell apart around him, the threat of assassination was so constant that paranoia became a survival skill. Medieval kings couldn't trust anyone, not their food tasters, not their bodyguards, not their advisors, and definitely not their family members. Every meal could be poisoned, every gathering could be an ambush, and every ally could be a potential assassin. Kings developed elaborate security protocols, including multiple food tasters, rotating guards, and secret passages in their castles, but even these precautions couldn't guarantee safety when everyone around you had a motive to kill you. The methods of assassination were limited only by the imagination of your enemies. Poison was popular because it was subtle and could be administered by anyone with access to your food or drink. Some kings were stabbed by their own guards, others were killed during supposedly friendly meetings with allies, and a few were even murdered by their own wives or children. The constant threat of death created a level of stress that would have driven modern leaders to nervous breakdowns, but medieval kings had to project strength and confidence even while knowing that their next breath might be their last. Edward II of England provides a perfect example of how medieval kingship could go horribly wrong. He was deposed by his own wife and her lover, who then had him murdered in one of the most gruesome ways imaginable, allegedly by inserting a red-hot poker into his rectum. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes, but everyone knew what had really happened. This wasn't unusual, it was just another Tuesday in medieval politics where family members regularly tortured each other to death for political advantage. Foreign warfare was another constant source of stress because medieval kingdoms were surrounded by enemies who were always looking for opportunities to invade and conquer. Kings had to maintain armies, build fortifications, and constantly prepare for wars that could start at any moment over the smallest perceived slight or territorial dispute. Medieval diplomacy was essentially organized hostility, with treaties that lasted only as long as it was convenient and alliances that shifted with the wind. The financial burden of constant warfare was crushing. Kings had to fund armies, build castles, maintain equipment, and pay for supplies, all while dealing with primitive economic systems that made it nearly impossible to generate reliable revenue. Taxation was limited by what the nobles would tolerate, trade was frequently disrupted by wars and raids, and agricultural production was constantly threatened by weather, disease, and enemy attacks. Many kings found themselves in the impossible position of needing money for defense but being unable to raise funds without triggering rebellions from overtaxed subjects. The military campaigns themselves were exercises in organized chaos where everything that could go wrong usually did. Medieval armies were notoriously difficult to control, with soldiers who were more interested in looting than following orders and noble commanders who pursued their own agendas rather than supporting the king's strategy. Supply lines were primitive and unreliable, meaning that armies often ran out of food, weapons, or basic necessities at critical moments. Weather could turn a perfectly planned campaign into a disaster, and disease killed more soldiers than enemy weapons ever did. Kings were expected to personally lead their armies into battle, which meant putting themselves directly in harm's way every time they went to war. This wasn't symbolic leadership. Medieval warfare required kings to be on the front lines, fighting alongside their men and proving their courage through personal combat. Many kings died in battle, not because they were poor military leaders but because medieval warfare was essentially legalized murder where survival depended more on luck than skill. Richard the Lionheart spent most of his reign fighting in the Crusades, where he gained a reputation as a great warrior but nearly died multiple times from combat injuries and disease. He was eventually killed by a crossbow bolt while besieging a minor castle in France, dying from an infected wound because medieval medicine couldn't treat even simple injuries effectively. His death left England in the hands of his incompetent brother John, demonstrating how the personal risks of medieval kingship could have disastrous consequences for entire kingdoms. The psychological toll of constant warfare was enormous. Kings had to make decisions that would result in the deaths of thousands of people, deal with the guilt of sending men to die for political objectives, and live with the knowledge that their military failures would result in their own deaths and the destruction of their kingdoms. The responsibility for the lives and welfare of entire populations rested on their shoulders, and there was no one to share that burden with because everyone else was either an enemy or a potential traitor. The administrative burden of medieval kingship was overwhelming because kings were responsible for everything from military defense to agricultural policy to judicial decisions. Medieval governments were primitive by modern standards, with limited bureaucracies and communication systems that made it nearly impossible to effectively govern large territories. Kings had to personally oversee countless details of government administration while also dealing with military threats, political crises, and diplomatic challenges. The judicial responsibilities of medieval kings were particularly stressful because they were expected to personally resolve disputes and dispense justice, often in cases where there were no clear right answers. Medieval law was a patchwork of local customs, religious obligations, and royal decrees that frequently contradicted each other. Kings had to make decisions that would satisfy competing interest groups while also maintaining their own political position, knowing that every judicial decision created new enemies and resentments. The relationship between kings and the church was particularly fraught because religious leaders wielded enormous political power and weren't hesitant to use it against kings who displeased them. Popes could excommunicate kings, effectively declaring them enemies of God and releasing their subjects from obligations of loyalty. Religious rebellions were some of the most dangerous threats kings faced because they combined political opposition with religious fervor, creating movements that were nearly impossible to suppress through conventional means. Henry II of England provides a famous example of how conflicts with the church could destroy a king's reign. His dispute with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, escalated until 4 of Henry's knights murdered Becket in Canterbury Cathedral, believing they were carrying out the king's wishes. The assassination turned Becket into a martyr and made Henry a villain throughout Christian Europe. He was forced to do public penance, walking barefoot to Becket's tomb and allowing himself to be whipped by monks, but the damage to his reputation and authority was permanent. The constant travel required by medieval kingship was exhausting and dangerous. Kings couldn't rule effectively from a single location because medieval communication systems were too primitive to allow centralized administration. This meant constantly moving from place to place, dealing with local problems, showing the royal presence, and maintaining personal relationships with local nobles and officials. Medieval travel was slow, uncomfortable, and dangerous, with bad roads, poor accommodations, and constant threats from bandits or enemy forces. The economic pressures of medieval kingship were relentless because kings were expected to maintain royal courts, fund military operations, and provide for the welfare of their subjects while working with primitive financial systems that made it nearly impossible to generate adequate revenue. Medieval taxation was inefficient and often counterproductive. Trade was limited by transportation difficulties and constant warfare, and agricultural production was subject to weather variations and crop failures that could bankrupt entire kingdoms overnight. Marriage and family life for medieval kings were matters of political strategy rather than personal choice, with royal marriages arranged to secure alliances, prevent wars, or gain access to resources. Kings often found themselves married to people they had never met, from foreign countries with different languages and customs, in relationships that were more like business partnerships than personal unions. The pressure to produce male heirs was constant and overwhelming, with the knowledge that failure to secure the succession would result in civil war and the destruction of everything they had worked to build. The treatment of royal children was dictated by political necessity rather than parental affection, with sons raised as potential rivals and daughters used as diplomatic bargaining chips in marriage negotiations. Kings had to balance their roles as fathers with their responsibilities as rulers, often finding themselves in situations where the good of the kingdom required actions that were harmful to their own children. The emotional toll of treating family members as political assets while maintaining the appearance of normal family relationships was enormous. The health challenges facing medieval kings were significant because medical knowledge was primitive and royal lifestyles were often harmful to long-term health. The constant stress of medieval kingship, combined with rich diets, excessive drinking, and the physical demands of medieval warfare, took a terrible toll on royal health. Kings who survived assassination attempts, battlefield injuries, and political crises often found themselves dying from diseases that would be easily treatable today. The lack of effective medical treatment meant that even minor health problems could become life-threatening for medieval kings. A simple infection could kill, and diseases that are now prevented by vaccination were major threats to royal health. The combination of poor medical knowledge and the inability to rest and recover properly due to political pressures meant that medieval kings often suffered from chronic health problems that affected their ability to rule effectively. The intelligence networks required by medieval kings were extensive but primitive, relying on personal relationships and informal communication systems that were easily compromised or manipulated. Kings needed to know about threats from foreign enemies, domestic rebellions, noble conspiracies, and assassination plots, but the information they received was often unreliable, incomplete, or deliberately falsified by people with their own agendas. The challenge of distinguishing between real threats and false alarms was constant and exhausting. The diplomatic requirements of medieval kingship involved maintaining complex relationships with multiple foreign powers, each with their own interests and agendas that often conflicted with royal objectives. Medieval diplomacy was conducted through personal relationships, marriage alliances, and informal agreements that could change rapidly based on shifting political circumstances. Kings had to be expert negotiators, able to make deals that would advance their interests while also preparing for the inevitable betrayals and alliance changes that characterized medieval international relations. The financial management required by medieval kingship was incredibly complex because it involved balancing the needs of multiple competing interest groups while working with primitive economic systems that made accurate financial planning nearly impossible. Kings had to fund military operations, maintain royal courts, support religious institutions, and provide for the welfare of their subjects while dealing with irregular income sources and unpredictable expenses. The lack of sophisticated financial instruments and banking systems meant that kings often found themselves in situations where they needed money immediately but had no way to raise it quickly. The social obligations of medieval kingship required kings to constantly perform the role of the perfect monarch while dealing with the brutal realities of medieval politics. Kings had to appear confident and powerful even when their kingdoms were falling apart, maintain elaborate court ceremonies even when they couldn't afford them, and project an image of divine authority even when they were struggling to survive from day to day. The gap between the public image of kingship and the private reality was enormous, creating psychological pressures that few modern leaders could comprehend. The environmental challenges facing medieval kings included dealing with natural disasters, crop failures, and disease outbreaks that could devastate entire kingdoms without warning. Medieval societies had very limited ability to predict or prepare for natural disasters, and kings were expected to provide relief and assistance during emergencies while also maintaining military defenses and political stability. The pressure to respond effectively to crises that were completely beyond human control added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming job. The technological limitations of medieval kingship meant that kings had to govern large territories and complex societies using communication and transportation systems that were barely adequate for local administration, much less centralized government. Messages took weeks or months to travel between different parts of a kingdom, making it nearly impossible to coordinate responses to rapidly changing situations. The lack of effective record-keeping systems meant that kings often had to rely on memory and personal relationships rather than written documentation to track important information. The cultural obligations of medieval kingship required kings to be patrons of the arts, supporters of learning, and promoters of cultural activities that would enhance the prestige and legitimacy of their reigns. This meant spending money on projects that had no immediate practical value while dealing with constant financial pressures from military and administrative necessities. Kings had to balance their roles as cultural leaders with their responsibilities as military commanders and political strategists, often finding themselves criticized for spending too much on luxury while being simultaneously expected to maintain the magnificent displays that were considered essential to royal authority. The legal responsibilities of medieval kings required them to be experts in multiple legal systems that often contradicted each other, including royal law, local customs, religious law, and international treaties. Kings had to make judicial decisions that would be accepted by different legal authorities while also advancing their own political interests and maintaining public order. The complexity of medieval legal systems, combined with the political implications of every legal decision, made the administration of justice a constant source of stress and controversy. The succession planning required by medieval kings was incredibly complex because it involved not just identifying heirs but also preparing them to survive in the brutal world of medieval politics. Kings had to train their sons to be warriors, politicians, and administrators while also protecting them from the various threats that surrounded royal heirs. The education of royal children involved learning languages, military skills, diplomatic protocols, and survival techniques that would allow them to navigate the dangerous world of medieval court politics. The pressure to maintain royal bloodlines was enormous because medieval legitimacy was based on hereditary claims that could be challenged if there were any questions about the purity or continuity of royal descent. Kings had to carefully manage marriage alliances, succession arrangements, and family relationships to ensure that their dynasties would survive beyond their own lifetimes. The genetic limitations of royal intermarriage, combined with the political necessities of maintaining pure bloodlines, often resulted in health problems and mental instabilities that made effective rule even more difficult. The military innovations that emerged during the medieval period meant that kings had to constantly adapt their strategies and tactics to deal with new weapons, fortification techniques, and battlefield technologies. The introduction of new military technologies often changed the balance of power between different kingdoms, requiring kings to invest in expensive military upgrades while also training their forces in new combat techniques. The pace of military innovation meant that strategies that were effective in one war might be completely obsolete by the next conflict. The social changes that occurred during the medieval period required kings to adapt their governing styles to deal with evolving social structures, economic systems, and cultural expectations. The rise of merchant classes, the development of urban centers, and the increasing importance of trade and commerce changed the relationship between kings and their subjects in ways that required new approaches to governance. Kings had to balance the traditional feudal obligations that formed the basis of their power with the emerging demands of more complex and sophisticated societies. The communication challenges facing medieval kings were significant because effective rule required constant contact with nobles, officials, and military commanders spread across large territories using transportation and communication systems that were slow and unreliable. Kings had to develop personal networks of trusted messengers and officials who could represent royal interests in distant locations while also ensuring that important information reached them quickly and accurately. The difficulty of maintaining effective communication meant that kings often found themselves making decisions based on incomplete or outdated information. The educational requirements for effective medieval kingship were enormous because kings needed to be experts in military strategy, diplomatic negotiation, legal administration, financial management, and cultural leadership while also maintaining the personal relationships that were essential to political survival. The lack of formal educational institutions meant that royal education was highly personal and often incomplete, leaving kings to learn essential skills through trial and error in situations where mistakes could be fatal. The psychological resilience required for medieval kingship was extraordinary because kings had to maintain their sanity and effectiveness while dealing with constant threats, overwhelming responsibilities, and the knowledge that failure would result in death for themselves and disaster for their kingdoms. The isolation of royal leadership, combined with the impossibility of finding trustworthy confidants or advisors, created psychological pressures that would challenge even modern mental health professionals. The legacy management required by medieval kings involved ensuring that their accomplishments would survive beyond their own lifetimes while also preparing their successors to deal with the ongoing challenges of royal leadership. Kings had to balance their desires to leave lasting monuments to their reigns with the practical necessities of maintaining political stability and military preparedness. The knowledge that their life's work could be undone by incompetent successors or political upheavals added another layer of pressure to already overwhelming responsibilities. The daily routine of a medieval king was a nightmare of constant vigilance and exhausting responsibilities that would have broken most modern leaders within weeks. Kings typically woke before dawn, not by choice but because sleeping too long made them vulnerable to attack. The first task of every day was checking with guards and advisors to ensure that no plots had developed overnight, no enemies had moved closer to the kingdom, and no nobles had decided to switch sides while the king slept. Even the simple act of getting dressed required careful consideration, as royal clothing had to project authority and wealth while also being practical enough for potential combat or emergency escape. The morning audiences that medieval kings were required to hold were exercises in political theater and psychological warfare. Every petitioner who approached the throne could be a potential assassin, every request for justice could be a trap, and every piece of news could signal the beginning of a crisis that would threaten the kingdom's survival. Kings had to listen to countless complaints, settle disputes, make judicial decisions, and respond to requests for favor or assistance while simultaneously evaluating the political implications of every word they spoke and every decision they made. The meals of medieval kings were elaborate security operations disguised as dining experiences. Food had to be prepared by trusted cooks, tested by multiple food tasters, and served by guards who had been thoroughly vetted for loyalty. Even then, the risk of poisoning was constant, as cooks could be bribed or threatened, food tasters could be working for enemies, and guards could be part of assassination plots. Many kings developed the habit of eating very little at formal meals, preferring to consume most of their food in private with only their most trusted servants present. The court ceremonies that medieval kings were required to attend were exhausting displays of political power that served multiple purposes beyond simple pageantry. These events were opportunities for nobles to demonstrate their loyalty or signal their dissatisfaction, for foreign ambassadors to assess the kingdom's strength or weakness, and for potential enemies to gather intelligence about royal security arrangements and personal habits. Kings had to maintain perfect composure and project absolute confidence even when they were dealing with serious threats or personal crises. The military reviews and training exercises that kings supervised were essential for maintaining army morale and combat readiness, but they were also dangerous gatherings where disloyal soldiers or officers could attempt assassinations or military coups. Kings had to inspect troops, review equipment, observe training exercises, and make strategic decisions while surrounded by armed men whose loyalty was always questionable. The balance between showing confidence in their forces and maintaining adequate personal security was delicate and constantly shifting. The diplomatic meetings that medieval kings conducted were complex negotiations where every word, gesture, and decision could have life or death consequences for the kingdom. Foreign ambassadors were often spies gathering intelligence for potential invasions. Marriage negotiations were actually discussions about military alliances and territorial claims, and trade agreements were frequently covers for political conspiracies. Kings had to be expert negotiators able to advance their interests while revealing as little as possible about their kingdom's weaknesses or strategic plans. The evening activities of medieval kings were no less stressful than their daytime responsibilities, as the hours after dark were considered the most dangerous time for assassination attempts and surprise attacks. Royal entertainment such as feasts, musical performances, and sporting events were actually elaborate security operations where every guest was a potential threat and every servant could be an enemy agent. Kings had to appear relaxed and sociable while maintaining constant awareness of their surroundings and ready access to escape routes or protective guards. The private moments that medieval kings managed to steal from their overwhelming public responsibilities were often spent in planning sessions with their most trusted advisors, reviewing intelligence reports about potential threats, or studying maps and documents related to ongoing military campaigns or diplomatic negotiations. Even their personal relationships with spouses, children, and close friends were complicated by political considerations and security concerns that made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. The seasonal cycles that governed medieval life created additional stresses for kings, as different times of year brought different types of challenges and opportunities. Spring was the traditional season for beginning military campaigns, which meant months of preparation for potential wars, diplomatic negotiations to secure alliances or prevent conflicts, and administrative arrangements to ensure that kingdoms could function while kings were away leading armies. Summer was the peak season for warfare, when kings were most likely to be personally leading troops in battle or defending their territories against enemy invasions. Autumn brought the harvest season, when kings had to oversee the collection of agricultural taxes that would fund their governments and armies while also ensuring that enough food was left for their subjects to survive the winter. The success or failure of harvests could determine whether kingdoms would prosper or face starvation and rebellion, making this a particularly stressful time for royal leadership. Winter was theoretically a time for rest and recovery, but in practice it was when kings dealt with the administrative backlog that had accumulated during the active campaign season while also planning for the challenges that would come with the next spring. The religious calendar that dominated medieval life created additional obligations and opportunities for royal leadership, as kings were expected to participate in elaborate religious ceremonies, support church activities, and demonstrate their piety through public displays of devotion. These religious obligations often conflicted with practical political and military necessities, forcing kings to balance their roles as Christian monarchs with their responsibilities as military commanders and political leaders. The feast days and religious festivals that punctuated the medieval calendar were particularly challenging for royal security, as these events brought together large crowds of people including many potential enemies and created opportunities for assassination attempts or political demonstrations. Kings had to participate in these public celebrations to maintain their legitimacy and demonstrate their religious devotion, but doing so required extensive security preparations and constant vigilance against potential threats. The pilgrimage obligations that were expected of medieval kings created enormous logistical and security challenges, as these journeys required leaving the kingdom for extended periods while traveling through potentially hostile territories with limited military protection. Kings who undertook pilgrimages had to arrange for the governance of their kingdoms in their absence while also ensuring their own survival during dangerous journeys that could take months or even years to complete. The crusading obligations that affected many medieval kings created additional military and financial burdens that complicated already difficult royal responsibilities. Kings who participated in crusades had to raise armies, fund military expeditions, and lead dangerous campaigns in foreign territories while leaving their kingdoms vulnerable to attack from local enemies. The financial costs of crusading were enormous, often requiring kings to mortgage their kingdoms or impose heavy taxes that triggered domestic rebellions. The marriage negotiations that were a constant part of medieval royal life were complex diplomatic and political processes that required careful consideration of multiple competing interests and long-term strategic implications. Royal marriages were not personal choices but political alliances that could determine the fate of kingdoms, making the selection of spouses for themselves and their children one of the most important decisions that medieval kings had to make. These negotiations often took years to complete and involved detailed discussions about dowries, territorial claims, succession arrangements, and military obligations that could bind kingdoms for generations. The child-rearing responsibilities of medieval kings were complicated by the need to prepare royal children for the brutal realities of political life while also protecting them from the various threats that surrounded royal families. Young princes had to be trained in military skills, diplomatic protocols, administrative procedures, and survival techniques while being constantly guarded against kidnapping, assassination, or political manipulation by their father's enemies. The education of royal daughters was equally complex, as these princesses would become valuable diplomatic assets in marriage negotiations but also potential threats if they fell into the wrong hands or developed political ambitions of their own. Medieval kings had to balance their paternal affections with cold political calculations about how their children could best serve the interests of the kingdom. The household management required by medieval kings involved supervising hundreds or even thousands of servants, guards, officials, and courtiers who lived and worked in royal castles and palaces. Each of these individuals represented a potential security risk, as any one of them could be bribed, threatened, or convinced to participate in assassination plots or espionage activities. Kings had to maintain elaborate systems for vetting and monitoring their household staff while also ensuring that these employees remained loyal and effective in their duties. The financial accounting that medieval kings had to oversee was incredibly complex and time-consuming, involving tracking income from dozens of different sources including agricultural taxes, trade duties, legal fees, and feudal obligations while also monitoring expenses for military operations, construction projects, administrative salaries, and diplomatic activities. The primitive accounting methods available in medieval times made it difficult to maintain accurate financial records, and the constant threat of embezzlement or fraud by royal officials added another layer of complexity to financial management. The construction projects that medieval kings undertook were enormous undertakings that required careful planning, massive financial resources, and constant supervision to ensure that they were completed on time and within budget. Castles, churches, roads, and other infrastructure projects were essential for maintaining royal power and kingdom security, but they were also expensive and time-consuming endeavors that diverted resources from other important activities like military preparedness and administrative functions. The legal reforms that progressive medieval kings attempted to implement were often controversial and dangerous political undertakings that could trigger rebellions from nobles who benefited from existing legal systems or create conflicts with religious authorities who claimed jurisdiction over certain types of legal matters. Kings who tried to modernize their legal systems or extend royal authority into new areas often found themselves facing organized opposition from powerful interest groups who preferred the status quo. The technological innovations that emerged during the medieval period created both opportunities and challenges for royal leadership, as new military technologies could provide advantages over enemies but also required expensive investments in equipment and training. Kings had to stay informed about developments in weapons technology, fortification design, siege warfare, and naval construction while also ensuring that their kingdoms had access to the skilled craftsmen and raw materials needed to implement these innovations. The trade relationships that medieval kingdoms maintained with foreign partners were essential for economic prosperity but also created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit through economic warfare or diplomatic pressure. Kings had to balance the benefits of international trade against the risks of becoming dependent on foreign suppliers or allowing enemy agents to gain access to their territories through commercial activities. The intelligence gathering that was essential for medieval royal survival required maintaining networks of spies, informants, and diplomatic agents throughout their own kingdoms and in foreign territories. These intelligence operations were expensive and dangerous, as captured agents could be tortured or executed, and the information they provided was often unreliable or deliberately falsified by double agents working for enemy governments. The alliance management that medieval kings practiced involved maintaining complex relationships with multiple partners who often had conflicting interests and changing political priorities. Medieval alliances were notoriously unstable, with partners frequently switching sides based on changing circumstances or better offers from competing powers. Kings had to constantly evaluate the reliability of their allies while also preparing for the possibility that today's friends could become tomorrow's enemies. The territorial expansion that ambitious medieval kings pursued was an expensive and risky undertaking that required military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, and administrative arrangements for governing newly conquered territories. Successful expansion could provide additional resources and strategic advantages, but failed expansion attempts could bankrupt kingdoms and leave them vulnerable to enemy attacks. The defensive preparations that all medieval kings had to maintain included building and maintaining fortifications, training and equipping armies, stockpiling supplies for potential sieges, and developing evacuation plans for use in case of enemy invasion. These preparations were expensive and time-consuming, but failure to maintain adequate defenses could result in the rapid conquest and destruction of entire kingdoms. The succession planning that responsible medieval kings undertook was a complex process that involved not only identifying and training heirs but also managing the political implications of succession arrangements. Clear succession plans could prevent civil wars but also created targets for enemy action, while ambiguous succession arrangements could preserve flexibility but increase the risk of internal conflicts after the king's death. The cultural development that enlightened medieval kings promoted included supporting artists, writers, musicians, and scholars who could enhance the prestige and legitimacy of their reigns while also preserving and advancing human knowledge and creativity. These cultural investments were expensive and had no immediate practical benefits, but they were important for maintaining the soft power that complemented military strength in establishing royal authority. The religious relationships that medieval kings maintained with church authorities were essential for legitimacy but also created constraints on royal behavior and policy options. Kings needed religious support to maintain their authority over Christian subjects, but religious leaders often had their own political agendas that could conflict with royal interests. The balance between supporting religious institutions and maintaining royal autonomy was delicate and constantly evolving. The natural disaster response that medieval kings had to provide when earthquakes, floods, famines, or disease outbreaks affected their kingdoms was both a humanitarian obligation and a political necessity. Effective disaster response could enhance royal popularity and demonstrate competent leadership, while inadequate responses could trigger rebellions or create opportunities for enemy invasion. The border security that medieval kings maintained was a constant challenge that required monitoring and defending hundreds or thousands of miles of frontier territory against enemy raids, smuggling operations, and unauthorized border crossings. Medieval borders were often poorly defined and difficult to patrol, making it easy for enemies to infiltrate kingdoms or for valuable resources to be stolen by cross-border raiders. The urban management that medieval kings practiced in governing growing cities and towns required balancing the economic benefits of urban development against the security risks created by large concentrations of population. Cities were centers of trade and craft production that generated tax revenue and military recruitment opportunities, but they were also potential centers of rebellion and targets for enemy attack. Their agricultural oversight that medieval kings provided was essential for maintaining food security and tax revenue but also required extensive knowledge of farming techniques, weather patterns, crop varieties, and livestock management. Kings who failed to maintain productive agricultural systems could face famines that would trigger massive population movements, social unrest, and economic collapse. The naval development that coastal medieval kingdoms required involved building and maintaining fleets of warships and merchant vessels that could protect maritime trade routes and defend against seaborne invasions. Naval operations were expensive and technically complex, requiring specialized knowledge of shipbuilding, navigation, and maritime warfare that many medieval kings lacked. The diplomatic protocol that medieval kings had to master included understanding the complex etiquette and ceremonial requirements that governed international relations in a world where personal relationships between monarchs often determined the fate of entire kingdoms. Failure to properly observe diplomatic protocol could cause international incidents that led to wars, while skillful diplomatic performance could prevent conflicts and create advantageous alliances. The prison management that medieval kings supervised involved maintaining facilities for holding captured enemies, political prisoners, and common criminals while also ensuring that these facilities served their purposes without creating security risks or humanitarian problems. Medieval prisons were often escape-prone and expensive to maintain, but they were necessary for maintaining order and demonstrating royal authority. The taxation systems that medieval kings implemented had to generate adequate revenue for government operations while remaining politically acceptable to subjects who had limited ability to pay and numerous other demands on their resources. Medieval taxation was often inefficient and corrupt, with tax collectors who embezzled funds and taxpayers who avoided or resisted their obligations. The military recruitment that medieval kings conducted required balancing the need for adequate military forces against the economic and social costs of removing men from productive activities like farming and craft production. Medieval armies were often unreliable and difficult to maintain, with soldiers who deserted at harvest time and commanders who pursued personal agendas rather than following royal orders. The technological espionage that forward-thinking medieval kings practiced involved attempting to acquire information about enemy military innovations, agricultural techniques, and craft production methods that could provide competitive advantages. This espionage was dangerous and expensive, but kingdoms that fell behind in technological development could quickly become vulnerable to more advanced enemies. The environmental management that medieval kings provided included overseeing forest conservation, water resource development, mining operations, and wildlife preservation that were essential for long-term economic sustainability. Medieval societies had limited understanding of environmental science, but they could observe the effects of deforestation, soil depletion, and water pollution on agricultural productivity and public health. The artisan oversight that medieval kings exercised involved supporting and regulating craft production activities that were essential for economic development but also potential sources of political unrest if craftsmen became organized and demanded political representation or better working conditions. Medieval craft guilds were often powerful political forces that could support or oppose royal policies depending on how their interests were affected. The linguistic management that medieval kings practiced in governing multilingual kingdoms required balancing the practical benefits of using common languages for administration and communication against the political risks of alienating ethnic groups who spoke different languages. Language policies could either help unite diverse populations under royal authority or create resentments that led to separatist movements and civil conflicts. The architectural planning that medieval kings supervised involved designing and constructing buildings that would serve practical functions while also demonstrating royal power and cultural sophistication. Medieval architecture was expensive and time-consuming to construct, but impressive buildings could enhance royal prestige and provide practical benefits like improved defense capabilities or administrative efficiency. The transportation development that medieval kings promoted included building and maintaining roads, bridges, and harbors that were essential for military movement, trade development, and administrative communication. Medieval transportation infrastructure was primitive and vulnerable to weather damage and enemy destruction, but it was crucial for maintaining effective governance over large territories. The educational oversight that enlightened medieval kings provided involved supporting schools, libraries, and universities that could train administrators, clergy, and military officers while also preserving and advancing human knowledge. Medieval education was expensive and had no immediate practical benefits, but educated populations were more productive and easier to govern than illiterate ones. The medical care that medieval kings arranged for their subjects was both a humanitarian obligation and a practical necessity for maintaining productive populations and preventing disease outbreaks that could devastate entire kingdoms. Medieval medicine was primitive and often ineffective, but basic public health measures like quarantine procedures and waste management could prevent epidemic diseases that would kill thousands of people. The entertainment industry that medieval kings supported included sponsoring festivals, tournaments, musical performances, and other cultural activities that provided recreation for their subjects while also demonstrating royal wealth and power. These entertainment activities were expensive and had no immediate practical benefits, but they were important for maintaining public morale and social cohesion. So the next time you think about medieval kings, remember that wearing a crown in those days wasn't about luxury and privilege, it was about surviving in a world where everyone wanted to kill you, where every decision could trigger a war, and where the price of failure was death. These weren't pampered aristocrats living in comfort, they were warriors, politicians, and administrators fighting for survival in a brutal world where the only reward for success was the chance to face even greater challenges tomorrow. The medieval kings who managed to die of old age rather than assassination or battlefield death were the exceptions, not the rule, and their success came through a combination of skill, ruthlessness, and extraordinary luck that few people in any era could match. The crown was not a symbol of privilege but a target painted on your forehead, and the throne was not a seat of power but an electric chair that slowly killed everyone who dared to sit on it. The weather management that medieval kings had to consider was far more critical than modern leaders can imagine because climate patterns directly affected agricultural production, military campaigns, and the overall stability of their kingdoms. A single bad harvest caused by drought, flooding, or early frost could trigger famines that would kill thousands of people and create social unrest that threatened royal authority. Kings had to maintain detailed knowledge of weather patterns, seasonal variations, and agricultural cycles while also preparing for climate emergencies that could devastate their territories without warning. The food security planning that responsible medieval kings implemented involved maintaining strategic reserves of grain and other essential supplies that could sustain populations during famines or sieges while also managing distribution systems that could deliver food to affected areas during emergencies. These food security systems were expensive to maintain and difficult to manage, but failure to prepare for food shortages could result in massive population movements, social uprisings, and political collapse that would destroy entire kingdoms. The disease prevention measures that medieval kings attempted to implement were primitive by modern standards but essential for preventing epidemic outbreaks that could kill substantial portions of their populations and cripple their military forces. Medieval understanding of disease transmission was limited, but observant kings could implement quarantine procedures, waste management systems, and public health regulations that would reduce the spread of infectious diseases. The population management challenges that medieval kings faced included dealing with demographic changes caused by wars, famines, diseases, and migration patterns that could dramatically alter the social and economic composition of their kingdoms. Population growth could strain resources and create social tensions, while population decline could reduce tax revenues and military recruitment potential, making kingdoms vulnerable to enemy attacks. The economic diversification efforts that forward-thinking medieval kings pursued involved promoting trade development, craft production, and agricultural innovation that could reduce their kingdom's dependence on single economic sectors and increase overall prosperity. Economic diversification was risky and expensive, but kingdoms that relied too heavily on single economic activities could face catastrophic collapse if those activities were disrupted by wars, natural disasters, or market changes. The resource extraction oversight that medieval kings provided included managing mining operations, forestry activities, and fishing industries that were essential for generating revenue and providing raw materials for military and civilian use. These resource extraction activities were often environmentally destructive and socially disruptive, but they were necessary for maintaining the economic foundation that supported royal authority and kingdom defense. The luxury goods management that medieval kings practiced involved balancing the political benefits of displaying wealth and sophistication against the financial costs of acquiring expensive items that had no practical value. Royal luxury displays were important for maintaining prestige and demonstrating power to both domestic and foreign audiences. But excessive spending on luxury goods could bankrupt kingdoms and trigger rebellions from overtaxed subjects. The diplomatic gift exchange that medieval kings participated in was a complex system of international relationship management that required carefully calculated displays of generosity and reciprocity. The gifts that kings gave to foreign leaders had to be impressive enough to maintain dignity and demonstrate wealth while not being so valuable that they strained royal finances or created expectations for future generosity that could not be sustained. The ceremonial obligations that medieval kings fulfilled were exhausting performances that required maintaining perfect composure and dignity during elaborate rituals that could last for hours or even days. These ceremonies were essential for maintaining royal legitimacy and religious authority, but they were also opportunities for enemies to attempt assassinations or gather intelligence about royal security arrangements and personal habits. The court entertainment management that medieval kings supervised involved organizing elaborate festivals, tournaments, hunts, and other recreational activities that provided diversion for nobles and courtiers while also serving political purposes like demonstrating royal wealth and maintaining social hierarchies. These entertainment events were expensive and logistically complex, but they were necessary for maintaining court morale and political stability. The personal security arrangements that medieval kings maintained were elaborate systems of protection that included bodyguards, food tasters, secure transportation, and safe housing that were designed to prevent assassination attempts while allowing kings to fulfill their public obligations. These security measures were expensive and often ineffective, as determined assassins could usually find ways to circumvent even the most sophisticated protection systems. The sleeping arrangements that medieval kings used were carefully planned security operations that involved rotating between different bedrooms, using decoy sleepers, and maintaining guard schedules that would prevent nighttime assassination attempts. Many kings suffered from chronic insomnia caused by the stress of constant threat assessment and the difficulty of finding truly secure places to rest. The travel security that medieval kings required when moving between different parts of their kingdoms involved extensive planning and coordination to ensure safe passage through territories that might contain hostile forces, bandits, or assassination teams. Royal travel was slow and expensive because of the large security escorts that were necessary to protect kings during journeys that could take weeks or months to complete. The communication security that medieval kings maintained involved developing codes, using trusted messengers, and creating multiple channels for important information that would prevent enemies from intercepting or falsifying royal communications. Medieval communication systems were vulnerable to disruption and manipulation, making it difficult for kings to maintain reliable contact with distant parts of their kingdoms or coordinate responses to rapidly developing situations. The financial auditing that medieval kings conducted involved monitoring the activities of tax collectors, treasury officials, and other financial administrators who had opportunities to embezzle funds or manipulate accounting records. Medieval financial systems were primitive and difficult to audit, making it easy for corrupt officials to steal substantial amounts of money without being detected. The military intelligence gathering that medieval kings sponsored involved maintaining networks of spies and informants who could provide information about enemy military preparations, troop movements, and strategic plans. Military intelligence was essential for defensive planning and strategic decision-making, but it was also dangerous and expensive to maintain, as captured intelligence agents could be tortured or executed by enemy forces. The technological development programs that innovative medieval kings supported included funding research into new weapon systems, fortification designs, agricultural techniques, and craft production methods that could provide competitive advantages over enemy kingdoms. Technological development was expensive and often unsuccessful, but kingdoms that fell behind in technological advancement could quickly become vulnerable to more innovative enemies. The cultural preservation efforts that enlightened medieval kings undertook involved protecting libraries, supporting scholars, and maintaining educational institutions that preserved and transmitted human knowledge across generations. Cultural preservation was expensive and had no immediate practical benefits, but it was important for maintaining the intellectual foundation that supported advanced governance and military strategy. The religious diplomacy that medieval kings practiced involved maintaining relationships with church hierarchies, managing conflicts between different religious groups, and balancing secular authority against religious obligations. Religious diplomacy was complex and dangerous, as religious leaders often had their own political agendas that could conflict with royal interests, and religious conflicts could trigger devastating civil wars. The marriage diplomacy that medieval kings conducted involved arranging strategic marriages for themselves and their children that would create political alliances, prevent wars, or gain access to important resources. Marriage diplomacy was a long-term strategic process that required careful evaluation of multiple competing interests and consideration of complex succession implications that could affect kingdoms for generations. The hostage management that medieval kings practiced involved holding important prisoners who could be used as bargaining chips in diplomatic negotiations or as insurance against enemy attacks. Hostage management required maintaining secure facilities and guard forces while also ensuring that hostages were treated well enough to maintain their value as diplomatic assets. The refugee assistance that medieval kings provided during times of war or natural disaster involved providing food, shelter, and protection for displaced populations while also managing the social and economic disruptions caused by large-scale population movements. Refugee assistance was expensive and logistically challenging, but failure to provide adequate assistance could create humanitarian crises that would damage royal legitimacy and create security threats. The border fortification projects that medieval kings undertook involved constructing elaborate defensive systems that could protect their territories against enemy invasions while also controlling trade and population movements across frontier regions. Border fortifications were expensive and time-consuming to build, but they were essential for maintaining territorial integrity and preventing enemy infiltration. The naval warfare preparation that coastal medieval kings conducted involved building and maintaining fleets of warships that could protect maritime trade routes and defend against seaborne invasions. Naval warfare was technically complex and expensive, requiring specialized knowledge of shipbuilding, navigation, and maritime combat tactics that many medieval rulers lacked. The siege warfare preparation that medieval kings implemented involved stockpiling supplies, training military engineers, and developing defensive strategies that could help their fortifications withstand extended enemy attacks. Siege warfare was a specialized form of combat that required extensive preparation and sophisticated engineering knowledge, but it was essential for defensive planning in an era when warfare often centered around capturing and holding fortified positions. The diplomatic immunity protocols that medieval kings established involved providing protection and safe passage for foreign ambassadors and diplomatic personnel while also maintaining security against potential spies or assassination teams. Disguised as diplomatic delegations. Diplomatic immunity was important for maintaining international relations, but it also created security vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. The succession crisis management that medieval kings planned involved preparing for the political upheavals that would inevitably follow their deaths while also ensuring that their chosen heirs would have the support and resources necessary to maintain royal authority. Succession crisis management was one of the most important long-term responsibilities of medieval kingship, as inadequate succession planning could result in civil wars that would destroy entire kingdoms. The economic warfare defense that medieval kings developed involved protecting their kingdoms against enemy attempts to disrupt trade, manipulate currency values, or create artificial shortages of essential goods. Economic warfare was a sophisticated form of conflict that required understanding of complex market dynamics and international trade relationships that many medieval rulers found difficult to comprehend. The propaganda management that medieval kings practiced involved controlling information flow, promoting favorable narratives about royal accomplishments, and countering enemy attempts to spread damaging rumors or false information. Medieval propaganda was primarily oral and visual, relying on public ceremonies, artistic displays, and word-of-mouth communication to shape public opinion. The judicial reform implementation that progressive medieval kings attempted involved modernizing legal systems, standardizing court procedures, and extending royal authority into areas that had previously been governed by local customs or religious law. Judicial reform was politically dangerous because it often challenged the interests of powerful nobles and religious authorities who benefited from existing legal arrangements. The urban planning oversight that medieval kings provided for growing cities involved managing infrastructure development, regulating construction activities, and ensuring that urban growth did not create security vulnerabilities or public health problems. Urban planning was a complex challenge that required balancing economic development against security concerns and public welfare considerations. Their agricultural innovation promotion that forward-thinking medieval kings supported involved encouraging farmers to adopt new crop varieties, farming techniques, and livestock management practices that could increase productivity and food security. Agricultural innovation was essential for supporting growing populations and generating tax revenues, but it was often resisted by conservative farmers who were reluctant to abandon traditional methods. The craftsman guild regulation that medieval kings imposed involved balancing the economic benefits of organized craft production against the political risks created by powerful guild organizations that could challenge royal authority. Craft guilds were important for economic development but also potential sources of political opposition if their interests conflicted with royal policies. The foreign trade negotiation that medieval kings conducted involved establishing commercial agreements with other kingdoms that would provide access to important goods while also ensuring that trade relationships did not create security vulnerabilities or economic dependencies. Foreign trade negotiation required sophisticated understanding of international markets and diplomatic protocols that many medieval rulers found challenging. The military technology transfer that medieval kings managed involved acquiring knowledge about enemy weapon systems and defensive techniques while also preventing their own military innovations from falling into enemy hands. Military technology transfer was a form of espionage that required careful coordination between diplomatic, military, and intelligence organizations. The religious festival management that medieval kings supervised involved organizing elaborate public celebrations that demonstrated royal piety and cultural sophistication while also maintaining security against potential threats from large public gatherings. Religious festivals were important for maintaining public morale and royal legitimacy, but they were also security challenges that required extensive planning and coordination. The disaster recovery coordination that medieval kings provided following natural disasters or military attacks involved organizing relief efforts, rebuilding damaged infrastructure, and restoring normal economic and social functions as quickly as possible. Disaster recovery was expensive and logistically complex, but effective disaster response could enhance royal popularity and demonstrate competent leadership. The intelligence counter-operations that medieval kings conducted involved identifying and neutralizing enemy spies and saboteurs while also protecting their own intelligence networks from detection and infiltration. Intelligence counter-operations were dangerous and complex activities that required sophisticated understanding of espionage techniques and security procedures. The prisoner exchange negotiations that medieval kings participated in involved trading captured enemies for their own personnel while also ensuring that exchange agreements did not provide enemies with valuable intelligence or strategic advantages. Prisoner exchange negotiations were delicate diplomatic processes that required careful evaluation of competing interests and long-term strategic implications. The cultural diplomacy programs that medieval kings sponsored involved promoting their kingdom's artistic and intellectual achievements while also gathering information about foreign cultural developments that might have military or political significance. Cultural diplomacy was a subtle form of international relations that could enhance royal prestige and create opportunities for intelligence gathering. The environmental conservation efforts that enlightened medieval kings implemented involved protecting forests, watersheds, and other natural resources that were essential for long-term economic sustainability. Environmental conservation was often opposed by short-term economic interests, but kingdoms that depleted their natural resources could face long-term economic decline and increased vulnerability to enemy attacks. The public health administration that medieval kings provided involved implementing sanitation systems, regulating food quality, and managing disease outbreaks that could threaten public welfare and military readiness. Public health administration was primitive by modern standards but essential for maintaining productive populations and preventing epidemic diseases that could devastate entire kingdoms. The transportation infrastructure maintenance that medieval kings supervised involved repairing roads, bridges, and harbors that were essential for military movement, trade development, and administrative communication. Transportation infrastructure maintenance was expensive and time-consuming, but failure to maintain adequate transportation systems could isolate parts of kingdoms and make them vulnerable to enemy attacks. The legal precedent establishment that medieval kings engaged in involved creating new laws and judicial procedures that would enhance royal authority while also providing fair and effective resolution of disputes. Legal precedent establishment was politically sensitive because it often challenged existing power relationships and required careful balancing of competing interests. The diplomatic protocol development that medieval kings practiced involved establishing formal procedures for international relations that would maintain royal dignity while also facilitating effective negotiation and communication with foreign powers. Diplomatic protocol development required sophisticated understanding of cultural differences and international customs that could affect the success of diplomatic initiatives. The military logistics coordination that medieval kings supervised involved ensuring that armies had adequate supplies, transportation, and support services during military campaigns. Military logistics coordination was one of the most complex and important aspects of medieval warfare, as armies that lacked adequate logistical support could quickly become ineffective regardless of their fighting ability. The succession law codification that medieval kings undertook involved establishing clear legal frameworks for royal inheritance that would prevent succession disputes while also ensuring that royal authority would be transferred to competent heirs. Succession law codification was politically sensitive because it affected the interests of multiple royal family members and could create or eliminate opportunities for various claimants to the throne. So when we think about the daily reality of medieval kingship, we must remember that these rulers lived in a constant state of crisis management, where every decision could have life or death consequences and every moment of relaxation could be their last. The stress of medieval kingship was not just political or military, it was existential, as kings knew that their survival depended on maintaining perfect vigilance in a world where everyone from their closest family members to their most trusted advisors could become deadly enemies at any moment. The medieval crown was not a symbol of privilege but a burden that crushed most of those who dared to wear it, and the few who survived to pass it on to their heirs did so only through a combination of extraordinary skill, ruthless determination, and incredible luck. That few people in any era could hope to match the castle maintenance responsibilities that medieval kings shouldered were enormous undertakings that required constant attention and massive financial resources. Medieval castles weren't just homes, they were complex military installations that needed ongoing repairs, upgrades, and modernization to remain effective against evolving siege technologies. Kings had to supervise the work of hundreds of craftsmen, engineers, and laborers while ensuring that maintenance activities didn't create security vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. The costs of castle maintenance were staggering, often consuming substantial portions of royal budgets, but failure to maintain these fortifications properly could result in rapid conquest by enemy forces. The weapon procurement programs that medieval kings managed involved acquiring and maintaining vast arsenals of swords, spears, crossbows, siege engines, and other military equipment that were essential for defending their kingdoms and conducting offensive operations. Medieval weapons required constant maintenance and periodic replacement, and technological advances meant that weapon systems could become obsolete quickly, requiring expensive upgrades or complete replacement. Kings had to balance the costs of maintaining cutting-edge military equipment against other budget priorities while ensuring that their forces remained competitive with enemy armies. The spy network management that medieval kings conducted was a shadowy world of espionage and counter-espionage that required maintaining agents in foreign courts, monitoring domestic threats, and protecting royal secrets from enemy intelligence operations. Medieval espionage was dangerous and expensive, with agents who could be captured, tortured, or turned into double agents by enemy forces. Kings had to evaluate the reliability of intelligence reports while protecting their own secrets and maintaining operational security that would prevent enemies from infiltrating their intelligence networks. The noble loyalty assessment that medieval kings constantly performed involved evaluating the trustworthiness and reliability of feudal lords who controlled significant military forces and territorial resources. Noble loyalty was always questionable because feudal obligations were based on personal relationships that could change rapidly based on shifting circumstances, family connections, or better offers from competing powers. Kings had to maintain detailed knowledge of noble family relationships, financial situations, and political ambitions while developing strategies for rewarding loyalty and punishing betrayal. The mercenary management that medieval kings practiced involved hiring professional soldiers who fought for money rather than feudal obligation or patriotic duty. Mercenaries were often more reliable and skilled than feudal levies, but they were also expensive and potentially dangerous because their loyalty lasted only as long as their pay continued. Kings had to evaluate mercenary companies, negotiate contracts, ensure adequate funding for mercenary wages, and develop contingency plans for situations where mercenary forces might switch sides or demand additional compensation. The siege supply stockpiling that medieval kings implemented involved maintaining strategic reserves of food, weapons, ammunition, and other essential supplies that could sustain their fortifications during extended enemy attacks. Siege supply stockpiling required enormous storage facilities, careful inventory management, and rotation systems that would prevent supplies from spoiling or becoming obsolete. The costs of maintaining adequate siege supplies were substantial, but failure to prepare for extended sieges could result in rapid surrender when enemy forces isolated royal strongholds. The diplomatic code management that medieval kings developed involved creating and maintaining secret communication systems that would allow secure contact with allies, agents, and military commanders while preventing enemies from intercepting or deciphering important messages. Medieval cryptography was primitive but essential for protecting sensitive information, and kings had to ensure that their codes remained secure while also being practical enough for use by messengers and officials who might have limited education or training. The royal household security that medieval kings maintained involved screening and monitoring hundreds of servants, guards, officials, and courtiers who had access to royal living quarters and personal information. Every person in the royal household represented a potential security threat, as any one of them could be bribed, blackmailed, or convinced to participate in assassination plots or espionage activities. Kings had to balance the need for adequate household staff against security concerns while maintaining loyalty through a combination of rewards, punishments, and constant surveillance. The succession intrigue management that medieval kings faced involved dealing with the complex political maneuvering that surrounded royal inheritance, as various family members, nobles, and foreign powers attempted to influence succession arrangements for their own benefit. Succession intrigue was particularly dangerous because it involved the people closest to the king, including his own children, siblings, and spouses who might have competing interests or ambitions that conflicted with royal preferences. The religious heresy monitoring that medieval kings conducted involved identifying and suppressing religious movements that challenged orthodox beliefs or royal authority. Religious heresy was politically dangerous because it could unite opposition groups under religious banners and create movements that were difficult to suppress through conventional military force. Kings had to work with church authorities to identify heretical movements while also ensuring that religious persecution didn't create martyrs or increase popular support for opposition causes. The plague response coordination that medieval kings provided during disease outbreaks involved implementing quarantine measures, organizing medical care, maintaining food supplies, and preventing social breakdown during health emergencies that could kill substantial portions of their populations. Medieval understanding of disease transmission was limited, but effective plague response required rapid decision-making and extensive coordination between medical, military, and administrative authorities. The currency management that medieval kings supervised involved maintaining stable monetary systems that would facilitate trade and economic development while preventing counterfeiting, currency manipulation, and inflation that could destabilize their economies. Medieval currency systems were often based on precious metals that could be debased or manipulated by unscrupulous officials, and international trade required maintaining exchange relationships with foreign currencies that could fluctuate in value. The military engineering oversight that medieval kings provided involved supervising the construction of fortifications, siege engines, and other military infrastructure that required sophisticated technical knowledge and skilled craftsmen. Military engineering was expensive and time-consuming, but it was essential for maintaining defensive capabilities and conducting successful military campaigns. Kings had to balance the costs of military engineering projects against other budget priorities while ensuring that these projects were completed on schedule and met military requirements. The court etiquette enforcement that medieval kings implemented involved maintaining elaborate systems of protocol and ceremony that demonstrated royal authority while also managing the complex social relationships between different court factions. Court etiquette was important for maintaining royal prestige and managing political relationships, but it was also time-consuming and expensive to maintain, requiring constant attention to detail and careful management of competing egos and ambitions. The foreign language proficiency that medieval kings needed involved learning multiple languages that were necessary for diplomatic communication, military coordination, and administrative oversight in multilingual kingdoms. Medieval Europe was linguistically diverse, and effective royal leadership often required the ability to communicate in Latin, French, German, and various local languages and dialects that were spoken in different parts of royal territories. The maritime trade protection that coastal medieval kings provided involved maintaining naval forces that could protect merchant vessels from pirates, enemy raiders, and hostile foreign powers while also regulating maritime commerce and collecting customs duties. Maritime trade protection was expensive and technically complex, requiring specialized knowledge of naval warfare and international maritime law that many medieval rulers found challenging. The border patrol coordination that medieval kings supervised involved maintaining military forces that could monitor frontier regions, prevent unauthorized border crossings, and respond to enemy raids or invasion attempts. Medieval borders were often poorly defined and difficult to patrol, making border security a constant challenge that required substantial military resources and careful coordination between different administrative and military authorities. The taxation innovation that medieval kings developed involved creating new revenue sources and collection methods that could generate adequate government funding while remaining politically acceptable to subjects who already faced numerous financial obligations. Medieval taxation was often inefficient and unpopular, but it was essential for funding military operations, administrative functions, and infrastructure projects that were necessary for maintaining royal authority. The alliance negotiation that medieval kings conducted involved creating and maintaining military and political partnerships with other kingdoms that could provide mutual defense, trade opportunities, and diplomatic support during international crises. Medieval alliances were notoriously unstable, with partners who frequently changed sides based on shifting circumstances or better offers from competing powers, making alliance management a constant challenge that required careful attention to changing political dynamics. The hostage diplomacy that medieval kings practiced involved exchanging important prisoners with enemy powers as part of peace negotiations or temporary truces that could provide breathing space during ongoing conflicts. Hostage diplomacy was a delicate process that required careful evaluation of the relative value of different prisoners while also ensuring that hostage exchanges didn't provide enemies with valuable intelligence or strategic advantages. The resource scarcity management that medieval kings faced involved dealing with shortages of essential materials like iron, wood, food, and skilled labor that could limit military capabilities and economic development. Resource scarcity was a constant challenge in medieval societies that had limited transportation and production capabilities, and effective resource management required careful planning and strategic allocation of available materials. The cultural assimilation policies that medieval kings implemented in conquered territories involved balancing the benefits of cultural integration against the risks of alienating local populations who might prefer to maintain their traditional customs and practices. Cultural assimilation was important for creating unified kingdoms, but it was also politically sensitive because it could trigger rebellions from ethnic groups who felt that their identities were being threatened. The technological espionage operations that medieval kings sponsored involved attempting to acquire information about enemy military innovations, agricultural techniques, and industrial processes that could provide competitive advantages. Technological espionage was dangerous and expensive, requiring skilled agents who could infiltrate enemy territories and gain access to closely guarded technical information without being detected or captured. The royal marriage politics that medieval kings navigated involved managing the complex relationships between different royal families throughout Europe, as marriages created alliances, inheritance claims, and potential conflicts that could last for generations. Royal marriage politics required careful consideration of multiple competing interests and long-term strategic implications that could affect the balance of power between different kingdoms. The criminal justice administration that medieval kings supervised involved maintaining legal systems that could provide fair resolution of disputes while also demonstrating royal authority and maintaining public order. Medieval criminal justice was often harsh and arbitrary, but it was essential for maintaining social stability and preventing the breakdown of law and order that could create opportunities for enemy invasion or domestic rebellion. The economic intelligence gathering that medieval kings conducted involved monitoring trade patterns, agricultural production, and financial activities that could provide information about enemy capabilities and intentions. Economic intelligence was important for strategic planning and diplomatic negotiation, but it was also difficult to gather and interpret without sophisticated analytical capabilities that most medieval governments lacked. The disaster preparedness planning that responsible medieval kings implemented involved developing contingency plans for natural disasters, military attacks, and other emergencies that could threaten their kingdom's survival. Disaster preparedness was expensive and time-consuming, but effective emergency planning could mean the difference between recovery and collapse when major crises occurred. The royal legacy preservation that medieval kings attempted involved ensuring that their accomplishments would be remembered and their dynasties would continue beyond their own lifetimes. Legacy preservation required careful attention to historical record-keeping, monument construction, and succession planning that would maintain royal achievements while also preparing successors to deal with ongoing challenges. The psychological warfare tactics that medieval kings employed involved using propaganda, intimidation, and deception to demoralize enemies and maintain domestic support without engaging in costly military conflicts. Psychological warfare was often more effective and less expensive than direct military action, but it required sophisticated understanding of human psychology and communication techniques that many medieval rulers found difficult to master. So in the end, medieval kingship represented one of history's most demanding and dangerous occupations, where the stakes were always life and death and the margin for error was essentially zero. These rulers lived every day knowing that their next decision could be their last, their next meal could be poisoned, and their next sleep could be interrupted by assassins or enemy armies. The crown that looked so glorious in portraits and ceremonies was actually a death sentence that most of its wearers couldn't escape, and the throne that appeared to be the seat of ultimate power was really an electric chair that slowly executed everyone brave or foolish enough to claim it. The few medieval kings who managed to survive and prosper did so through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, paranoia, and luck that would challenge even the most capable modern leaders, and their success came at a personal cost that few people in any era would be willing to pay.